How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to In with Denoux. We are doing another solo episode. And for those of you that have been around, you know, but if you're new, I'll explain that when I do these solo episodes, they are about half the time of a normal full episode if I have Gio or Jordan along with me. So we'll be here for about 20 or 30 minutes, somewhere around that time. And as you guys know, I've been doing this series on TikTok where we are walking through the Bible in a year. And I am currently in the book of Judges. And so a couple weeks ago, I did a solo episode about a hood. And the story of a hood in Judges is only about 18 verses. It's very short. So I thought, why not try to one up and do a story about someone who has even a shorter story in the book of Judges? And that is the judge that comes right after a hood. And so today we are going to be talking about Shamgar. And you may have never heard of a hood or Shamgar. And that is kind of what I've wanted to do, is try to find some obscure stories in the Bible or figures that maybe you've never heard of and bring their stories to light and just kind of point out some cool things. And this one took more digging and more just kind of thought. It's not really necessarily all fact, but thought, because it is so short. And like I said, the story of a hood was 18 verses, and this one is only one verse in the entire Bible. And yet the very verse tells us something very incredible. You know, it says that one man defeated 600 enemies with nothing but an ox goad. And we'll get into that a little bit more. And so I want to start off with the setting of this story and what is going on, because if we're going to talk about Shamgar and the judge that he was, we need to know what is going on in this time period. So the Israelites are a nation that keeps repeating the same cycle over and over. So Exodus, you have the leader in Moses. And as you move forward, Moses then passes on and you get the leader of Joshua. So you have these great leaders that have led the nation of Israel. But now you are in a time of chaos. So the cycle that keeps repeating itself is that Israel turns away from God. They fall into oppression. They cry out for help. Then God raises a judge to rescue them. And when you think of a judge, it's not what we think of today, of someone with a gavel that's proceeding over cases. This judge is what you would think of as a warlord or a freedom fighter, something like that. That is what a judge is in the book of Judges. So God raises up a judge to rescue them, and then peace returns for a while, only for the cycle to start over. And this is a 300-year cycle in the book of Judges. You know, it's a pattern of spiritual drift and divine rescue from God. And if I could tell you a theme of the book, I would say it is spiritual drift. What happens when you drift away from God? And so the Bible describes the entire period with one sentence that can really sum up a lot of the book, and it is that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. They've turned away from this conviction of God and following his law, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no central leadership like we talked about with Moses and with Joshua. There's no king. There's no stability. Israel was surrounded by hostile nations, and the one constant enemy that they had was the Philistines. You know, they weren't like a small time raider group that just kind of came in and out. The Philistines were technologically advanced. Their military was extremely powerful. They controlled key trade routes during this time. They produced iron weapons, which if you look into like a kingdom type study, this is a little bit of a side note, but if you look into a kingdom type study of the scriptures, and it kind of predicts like all these metals, and as you go through the scriptures, and even if you go through history outside of the Bible, these metals that it talks about, you see each one of the powerful nations that rises up in history uses those metals. It's a very, very cool study. If just a little side note, if you go back and do a study, but they produced iron weapons, did the Philistines. You know, they were intimidating and they were constantly oppressing the Israelites. So this is where Shamgar enters the story. So the entire story of Shamgar, as we've said, is this short little read. So let's read the verse. It's in Judges chapter 3, verse 31. So we talked about Ehud last time. So this verse says, after Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too saved Israel, saying he too as, Ehud before him. And that's it. That is the entire story of Shamgar. So you might be asking yourself, how are we going to do a 30-minute podcast, 40-minute podcast with this one passage? Well, that's a very good question. So there's no background of this character. There's no speech of this character. There's no detailed battle, right? So if I'm Shamgar and I read this, I can come forward in time and read this. I'm like, dang, I killed 600 Philistines. Like, where are the details at? But as many things in the scriptures, all the details of the battle is not always what is important. There's one sentence, and yet that sentence is loaded with meaning if you really meditate. I love that it talks about meditating on the scriptures, imagining, thinking about, why is this there? It's not there for no reason. Yet the details aren't there. All the cool stuff that we think of, the battle and how he killed the 600 Philistines with just an ox goad. What even is an ox goad? And we'll get to that, but it's just one sentence. And so I want to break it down. So who was Shamgar? The text calls him Shamgar, son of Anath. And that raises the interesting question of, Anath. And then the name of Anath, as I looked into it, was actually associated with a Canaanite warrior goddess. So some scholars believe that Shamgar may have, come from foreign heritage, meaning he might not have even been fully Israelite. And it's fascinating, but it's not unfamiliar if you really think about it, because God used an outsider to deliver Israel, and that has become a pattern throughout Scripture. If you read, God frequently uses unexpected and ordinary people, but obviously he uses people that aren't necessarily in the nation of Israel, right? And it's not always that they're not an Israelite, but also just unexpected, right? Like he uses a shepherd boy to defeat a giant in David. A runaway shepherd in David, leads a nation. Fishermen become apostles. Tax collectors become disciples. The Bible constantly reminds us that God's choices don't follow our expectations or the people of the day's expectations. When David came to fight Goliath, he was the only one that knew he was going to win because he had God on his side. And if you watched the episode last week that Gio and I did talking about the underdog story, you'll hear all about that. I really encourage you to listen to that. It was a really fun episode to do. But we see here again that God's choices don't follow human expectations. Shamgar may have been an outsider. He was unknown, but he became a deliverer for the nation of Israel. He freed them. So I want to talk a little bit about this weapon, an ox goad. What is an ox goad? So an ox goad was not a military weapon. It wasn't a sword. It wasn't a spear. It was more of a farming tool. And my favorite story in the Bible of Jonathan and his armor bearer talks a lot about, them not having weapons and only having farm tools then too. And so you kind of see a little bit of patterns with that through the scriptures as well. So the ox goad, it was a farmer's tool, and farmers used it to guide oxen while plowing the field. And when I looked it up, it's basically a long wooden pole with a sharp metal tip. And so it's an agriculture tool. It's not meant for military combat. And so it means that Shamgar likely wasn't a trained warrior, but he became one. He was a farmer, most likely. And so just picture this scene. Again, we don't have a lot of details here, so a lot of this has to be pictured in our mind. What was happening? A man working in the field, this farming tool, this ox goad in his hand, and suddenly he's confronted by Philistine forces. And instead of running, he fights with the only thing that he had available to him. This is where the story is really powerful, because Shamgar didn't wait until he had this perfect weapon. He could have ran, but he used what was already in his hands, what was given to him at that moment in time. And that principle, again, we don't have a lot of details in this passage, but we can use clues from other stories, right? The principle of using what you have, not needing what the world would expect you to have, including people, right? He's by himself and he doesn't have a military weapon. Like, at least maybe he have a sword if he's outnumbered, but he just has this farming tool. And that principle echoes throughout the Bible, right? And I want to give you some examples. God asked Moses, "What's in your hand?" And from that question, we see that he has a staff, which becomes the tool of miracles, right? Moses didn't have a spear or a sword or some sort of weapon of the day. He had a staff in which he used, the first thing we see is the staff becomes a snake. Then all the plagues play out. He parts the Red Sea. The staff becomes a tool of miracles. We already talked about David, right? He refuses Saul's armor, right? King Saul starts putting this armor on David and he talks about how he can't move. And so he refuses Saul's armor and he uses a slingshot and some stones to take down the giant that no one else could defeat because they didn't believe in God, didn't believe God could help them defeat this giant. A boy offers 5 loaves and 2 fish to Jesus, and it feeds the whole crowd. And so basically what I'm saying is that even though this passage is one verse, you can use the rest of the Bible to really start to make some educated guesses of what was happening here, because God often begins with ordinary things and ordinary people, as we see. And there's much more examples. These are just 3 examples I kind of came up with quickly of the staff of Moses, David refusing the armor that all the other military people were using. This boy offers Jesus 5 loaves and 2 fish, and miraculous things are done through ordinary, everyday things. Okay, so let's talk about this 600 enemies that were killed. The verse tells us, the main thing that it does tell us is that Shamgar killed 600 Philistines. And that is an incredible number, obviously. I think, none of us would think, okay, I could take on 600 of anything, unless it's like ants or something like that. So this number, it highlights something very important, because it's not just about the personal bravery that it obviously takes as one man to fight 600 men. It highlights something more important. This was divine empowerment, because by himself, he can't defeat 600 men, right? Throughout the book of Judges, God empowers individuals to accomplish things that seem impossible, right? The point isn't glorifying violence or war. That is not what God is putting at the forefront here. The point is showing that God can change impossible odds. And I think that is super important for our lives, because so often God is asking us, or God is using someone in our lives to ask us to do something that in our mind and with our experiences is impossible for us to do, or maybe for you, impossible for you to stop doing in some cases, right? God can change impossible odds. And I want you to imagine the psychological impact of this moment, right? There's Philistine soldiers confident in their power, confident in their strategy, confident in their technology, and suddenly they encounter a man who refuses to retreat despite the clear disadvantage numbers-wise. But not even only that, this is a farmer who has a farming tool in his hands. It's one man who clearly believes and trusts God, standing his ground. And sometimes courage can become a turning point, right? One of my dear friends, Kyle, used to say this phrase back in college, that a moment of boldness can change someone's life, whether it's your own, whether it's someone else, and I think boldness has become something that we look at something and say it's bold. Like back then, it's like, that's not bold. That's just something we should do. And I'm not saying that you should downplay, sharing your faith if you're someone that's afraid to speak up or to speak to strangers. Like, that is boldness, and boldness can mean something different for everyone. So I don't want to discourage that. So maybe I shouldn't downplay that, but I do just want to say that as Christians, we are called to be bold, no matter what that is, whether that's having a hard conversation, whether that is taking accountability for your actions, whether that is speaking up in a situation that's awkward, whether that be at work or at school when you see something that's not right, but everyone else is okay doing it. There is a lot of different levels of boldness and things that pop up in our lives. But when you do choose to be bold, I guess this is the way I should have worded it earlier when I was kind of downplaying boldness a little bit. It's more so that when you do something that is bold, it empowers you to be even more bold, to take on something that's a little bit tougher. And I told this story before in a sermon, but I'll tell a quick version of it. When I was in college, I think it was my sophomore year of college, at the beginning of each year, we would have these outreach events where we would play frisbee or, we'd have game nights, things like that. And it would take place simultaneously as Rush Week. I mean, this was in Gainesville, University of Florida, and I went to a smaller school nearby, but we did most of our events at the University of Florida because it's obviously much bigger. And so it was during the same time as Rush Week for the University of Florida. If you don't know what that means, it's when people are joining sororities and frats and they're doing these crazy parties, like wild parties. And so we had an event where we were playing frisbee and everyone had kind of left, and it was me and 4 or 5 of my friends. And someone amongst our group was like, hey, why don't we go to these frat houses and just go and share our faith, right? And so we decided to do it. And it was scary, man. Like we went, and basically we would go inside each of these frat houses, and there's hundreds and hundreds of people partying, drinking, listening to music, dancing, all this stuff. And we basically would like scream at the top of our lungs and like quiet the whole party down and basically say, hey, like, we're disciples of Jesus. And basically tell people, like, if you want to talk or you want to know more, like, we're going to be outside for 5 minutes. And we went to each frat house and did that. And we took turns, stopping the party, yelling at the top of our lungs. And it was scary, man. Like, it took some boldness, and it was a horrible idea. Like, when I say it was a horrible idea, it didn't work. Like, obviously it didn't work. Like, these people are at these wild, crazy parties and we're stopping it for a minute. No one came to talk to us, but I always tell that story as like, the premise of the idea and what we were hoping to happen didn't happen because that wasn't the best strategy. Just like an ox goad isn't the best weapon for battle. But what it did do for us, or for me anyways, and I'm sure I know it did it for some of the other people there, is that it emboldened me to where I'm like, man, if I could share my faith in the middle of a frat party with hundreds of people, then I can walk up to the group of 3 or 4 studying and has headphones on, and it's awkward to tell them to take their headphones off. Like, it emboldened me to, knock on the door and invite someone to a Bible talk or invite someone to church, invite some of my fellow classmates, invite a neighbor. It emboldened me to do these everyday things that did have more ability to work in someone's life, right? That someone would be more willing to come to church if I asked them at the grocery store than in the middle of a frat party. But it was more for me and my faith and those guys that were there with me, for our faith to give us this boldness to do more with our faith, right? And that's kind of what I picture, obviously in a much bigger stakes here in his life, is that, courage can be a turning point for a nation. And because of this, courage disrupts the fear that you have. And fear is often what keeps us oppressed in our own lives, in our minds, in our sin, and things of that nature. So anyways, okay, so the forgotten hero, Shamgar, the name you probably have never heard. Here's something fascinating. So Shamgar doesn't get the spotlight like we talked about earlier, right? Like if he's reading this now, he's like, man, why aren't the details in this story? Judges moves on quickly from this story. We get one verse. Other leaders in this book get entire chapters, but Shamgar gets one verse. So why is this, right? We don't know exactly, but possibly because his deliverance was for a little local part of Israel. Maybe it was short term, as we talked about this cycle, right? There'd be freedom for a period and then the cycle would start over. So maybe it was just a short cycle of obedience to God. But there's also something that is spiritually beautiful about this. And that is that not every act of faith gets a long story, right? There's things in our lives that we do that someone else does that, and I feel like maybe I'm going a little bit against that story that I told just a second ago. But, after we did that, it wasn't like we went and just started telling the story. And I use the story now to kind of hopefully help you to use things in your lives to increase your boldness. And I feel like so much time has passed that I can tell that story without it being something that's like hyping myself up, or because I feel like like as a young man, and we decided actually between us, like, hey, we're not going to go and just spread this story that we did this. Because I think in the time, like it would affect our pride. But I think now I can confidently share that story truly with the intent to help others, to do things that help you become bold in your faith and do things that scare you a little bit and have the courage to push forward and do it anyways, right? But not every act of faith needs a long story. Some people serve God faithfully, like Shamgar did here, and history barely remembers it or even records it. But heaven notices, God notices your faith. The world celebrates fame and fortune and recognition and influence, but God values faithfulness. Shamgar reminds us that even a brief moment of obedience matters, and it mattered for the nation of Israel. And, a lot of times too, we talk about this pattern that they went through in Judges, where they kept repeating this, this cycle of unfaithfulness and not trusting God. But each time they were saved, whether it was for a long period or a short period till they turned back away from God, each of those times they were saved physically as well, right? So it's like if Shamgar doesn't act, he acted, and maybe it was only a short period that they stayed obedient and faithful to God, but them physically being alive gave them another chance to do it again and to do it again. So it is important, and obedience matters even if the story is short. So what are some lessons we can learn from this one verse about Shamgar? What does it mean for us today? This tiny story holds huge lessons. And so number one, we've talked about this a lot. I kind of mix up what I've talked about on TikTok, what I've talked about on the pod, but I've talked about this a lot in some form or fashion, is that God uses ordinary people. Shamgar wasn't a king. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't famous even amongst the Israelites. He was likely just a farmer. And yet God used him to save Israel. And it shows us that you don't have to be extraordinary outwardly for God to use you. You just have to be available, and you have to have a heart that says yes. Number two, which we talked about a little bit, is use what is in your hand. And what that means is, Shamgar didn't wait for better equipment, a better weapon. He used what he had. And what that means is that, like, what God has given you, what God has blessed you with, whatever big or small in your mind talent, that God can use what you have. Many people delay obedience because they feel unprepared, or, they don't have the tools to speak or to help someone find God. But God often works with what's already in your life. We talked a little bit about this with a hood, right? Is that back then it was, even like today, it's more rare to be left-handed. Back then it was extremely rare, right? And a lot of that is why God used his left-handedness, to where when they checked for his weapon, it was on the opposite side of where most people had it, and they didn't even check that side. Therefore, he was available to save the Israelites. But God often uses what you already have in your life, your skills, your experiences, your resources, your story. Nothing is new under the sun, right? And so you can relate to someone with your skills, your experiences, your story. Small stories still matter. Shamgar only gets one verse, but that verse changed history. So never underestimate even the smallest act of courage, which I kind of started to do early in the episode. So don't be like me in that way. One conversation, one decision, one moment of bravery, those things can make waves in your life for longer than you think, right? Like many of us have seen that exercise done during church services or whatever, where it's like, hey, stand up if I helped you become a Christian. And then they say, all right, from the people standing up, like stand up if any one of these people, and by the end, like the whole church is standing, right? It's the domino effect, where one small act of courage can ripple through eternity. It can ripple through your community, through your family. And so one small act of courage can make a huge difference. Number 4 is that courage can break oppression. Oppression often, like we talked about earlier, thrives on fear. But when one person stands up, things change, right? It's that famous moment in movies. The first one that came to my mind just now as I was thinking about this was Hunger Games. I can't remember which one. The second one maybe, where Rue dies and they all start to, do the symbol with the 3 fingers and the whistle. And that's the kind of the moment of change, right? Where the districts start to stand up against the government and everything starts to change, right? So oppression can often thrive on fear, but when someone stands up, things change. Courage inspires courage. Leadership begins with someone refusing to stay silent, refusing to let wrongs go unrighted. And so just remember that courage can break oppression, and that can be oppression of any kind. It doesn't have to mean that like someone is oppressing you. It could mean the sin in your life, Satan oppressing you. Refuse to stay silent and allow Satan to just continue to oppress you. Maybe that means confession. Maybe that means, deleting that app or getting away from this group of people, whatever it looks like in your life. Don't stay silent. Make a change. Okay. I want to give you guys, I've been doing this the last couple episodes and I kind of like it. So I'm going to keep doing it. Is that, I came up with some just personal reflection type stuff. And so I want to give you some questions. And like I've said in the past, you can ignore these. If you're in the car, you can answer to yourself or talk to God out loud. Or if you're in your room or in bed, grab your phone, your notes app, pen and paper. If you're an old school person like me, sometimes I like to write things out and it brings things. Lots of times when I write, things come out that I didn't even know I was thinking or feeling. So I want to give you some questions to reflect on. So where might God be calling you to act with courage? It doesn't have to be some big, crazy thing. Maybe it's one small thing at work or at school or in your marriage or, with your significant other, with your children. Where is God calling you to act with courage? What ox goad is already in your hand, right? What do you already possess that God can use that you think, God can't use my humor. God can't use, my obscure talent that I have. What is it that you have that you can use for God in your life right now? The third question is, what ordinary part of your life could God use in extraordinary ways? So what we just talked about, right? What ox goad is already in your hand? How can God use that in extraordinary ways? Just imagine, dream for yourself. Man, I want to use this talent to XYZ to start a podcast. A lot of that for me was to be able to use this talent that I feel like I have to break down scripture, to teach people about the Bible, to bring some laughs, to take things that are confusing in the scriptures and break them down in a simple way. Obscure characters like this. This is one passage of scripture, and look how much you could learn from it by just using your imagination and thinking about how that scene played out with Shamgar. What can you use in extraordinary ways, and how can God use those things? Maybe you feel like your story and your life is insignificant, and maybe you feel overlooked, and maybe you feel like your influence is small. And that's how I feel sometimes, the only thing I kind of hate about all this of like putting myself out online and putting up podcasts is that you automatically become somewhat obsessed. And I'm trying not to be this way of how many likes do you get? How many followers do you have? I started this podcast, one of the first few episodes. I honestly can't remember what episode it was, but I'm trying to go back to this thought because I don't want to get caught up in the followers and the likes and the money and things that could come from this podcast in the future, right? But I talked about how when I used to preach, when I used to speak or do classes, that I would pray this prayer of, God, I hope one person is affected by the words that you've given me today or tonight. And that's what I want to, that's the heart that I want to have with this podcast and just with my life in general. When I'm blessed enough to be able to speak to a group of people, whether it's 5 or whether it's 5,000, that one person, will be affected by God's words, by my words that God has given me, and that they will change for the better because of that, right? Shamgar reminds us that God can do a lot with one willing person. Right? We see that throughout scripture. One willing person, one faithful act. God can do a lot with that. So I want to encourage you, you know, one of the beautiful things about God's word and about the scriptures that we read is that it includes people like Shamgar. Not everyone in the Bible is Moses or Joshua, like the books prior to Judges. Some are quiet heroes, faithful people, ordinary individuals who stepped up when it mattered, when they were called, or just in the moment when they weren't called. They just had to act. Ordinary individuals stepped up when it mattered. And that might be the most, relatable thing about this story, is that because majority of us won't be great leaders of nations or CEOs or people that, are well known on the internet, known in real life, have a big audience, but we can still change lives with our courage. So, excuse me. I hope that you enjoyed this little story. I was reading through Judges, and after I did a hood, I read the 18 verses of a hood, and I was like, yo, this is a crazy story. Like, let's do a podcast on this little short story. And then the very next judge is Shamgar, right? So I was like, well, we did this obscure character before and it was short. This one's only one verse. So let's dig in and have, look into it a little bit, find some cool things that we can find from one verse, but then also just imagine what this story could have been. Was he, like we kind of speculated in the podcast, was he just working in the field and, had the ox goad and these 600 men attacking? Did God come to him and ask him to attack these men? We don't know exactly, but we know he stepped up and he did it. He didn't run away. He didn't make excuses for not having a proper weapon. He just did it. And I think that that's a powerful lesson for us. No matter what the details are, we know that he stepped up and saved an entire nation with his actions. So, I really want to encourage y'all just to use your imaginations, man. Dig in the scriptures, learn what you can learn. But it talks about how we'll never fully understand God. And I think that's what makes the scriptures and using our imaginations, it makes it so fun, is that we don't know everything and we'll never know everything. But how fun it is to use the minds that God gave us to think and to deduce and figure things out, figure out what we can figure out, but then think about what could be. Is just something that I had a lot of fun doing with this story, and that it makes the scriptures just come alive for me. It makes it fun. And the scriptures are fun on their own, but sometimes you just gotta add in a little spice, add in something different. And that's what this was for me. So I hope that you all enjoyed it. I'm going to try to find more things like this, of just kind of obscure characters or obscure stories in the scriptures, and do them, especially as I go through the Bible in a Year series on TikTok. I definitely want to do an episode about Josiah, who's one of my favorite characters in all the scriptures. So we'll do the one about that. If there's any that y'all, want to learn about or want to know about, or, some stories that are obscure that you like, either you can come on the podcast and we'll have you on as a guest. We have some exciting guests that are also coming up here soon. I'm really working hard because I really want to have, some women on the podcast and get that woman perspective on things. And I just know so many amazing women, and I have 3 actually set up that are going to come on the podcast. I don't want to put their names out there yet in case some stuff falls through or whatever, but I have 3 amazing women that are friends of mine that are going to be on the podcast and talking about vastly different things, which I'm super, super excited about. We have one who's going to be talking about this thing that she's put together. This woman, she's so bright, this study that she put together to help Christian leaders with their communication and just things that, we've messed up a little bit. And, she sent me this paper and I've read through it and it's amazing. So she's going to come on and speak about that. And we have another woman who I have met recently who goes to church with me, who's going to talk about something she feels passionate about the scriptures. And then I have a third who, I knew from Broward, and she's going to be talking about this project that, she's working on, and this kind of, I don't even know exactly if it's business, if it's just like a group, but she's going to be talking about that a little bit. And I wanted to give her, even though the platform is very small, wanted to give her the opportunity to speak on that. And so I'm really, really looking forward to those 3 women hopping on here sometime in the near future. I mean, those will all be separate episodes, and So if you'd like to be on the podcast and talk about something that you're passionate about in your life, whether it's a story in the scriptures or just something you're learning or just some passion that you have in your life, it doesn't necessarily have to be scripturally based. But, with me, Jordan, and Gio, I just want to get some women on here. It's just to give them a voice and give them a platform and really learn from them and their expertise and the things that they're thinking about and learning in their own lives. So just to give you something to look forward to. But as always, we love you guys. Please like, comment, share. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please give us a rating and a review. And if you are watching on YouTube, please comment below. That will help us grow. Share this with your friends. And if you're loving it, keep watching. We really do appreciate those, especially our day oneers and those that are loyal to us and listening. So we love you guys. And as Jordan always says, I'm out.